I'm so sympathetic to parents with kids who are trying to pick which expert to trust.
Yes. What I've done as a parent, we're going to trust certain things like traffic lights and road works and aircraft and airlines and elevators. We're going to trust certain things that we know are beyond our ability to fully dig into. But I draw the line at that which you want to actually inject or you want my child to ingest. That becomes too much.
I don't know many people who are better at holding up their end of a meandering conversation than you. I just want to come out right with a kind of a shameless plug. I'm going to hold up your book. It's called Forbidden Facts. And I'm going to ask you right out of the gate, how in the world did you manage to put together so many claims, so much observational uh, dogma in such a condensed way, in a fashion that made me so angry, Gavin? You made me very angry. And then you made me snort and laugh, sometimes within the same paragraph as I was experiencing like a kind of rage. I was suddenly giggling out loud. Is that because you're a better writer than I thought you were, or because sometimes the truth is just so damn strange that there's nothing reasonable to do in the face of it except laugh?
Yes and no. The thing is, some of this stuff was just actually funny, and it's not a funny topic because the book is about the various methods that government uses to debunk facts they don't like, or falsely debunk them, and all the tricks they use. And so that's the part that's enraging because when you see it in practice, it really does piss you off. But then when you see it in, we got to go into the room because somebody leaked a lot of transcripts of some of these meetings, and that stuff is just like a one-act Broadway comedy. That stuff is just absolutely downright funny. The way these supposed scientists who are paid to debunk things engage with each other behind closed doors is ridiculous, as in worthy of ridicule.
Vaudevillian.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. I'm glad you found that as well. And look, listen, writing it, I was often really pissed off and often laughing, and that was just the reality of the gift that the government delivered to us for this book.
If you're not in on the joke, and if you're not capable of laughing at some of the horror show with which we've been confronted, then you might go mad. But because you're also curious, you need to you need to engage in a genuine inquiry. And I feel like what you've done with this book is really balance those two. I think it was Travis McGee that said the only sensible way to go through life was with the fatalistic attitude of a vaudevillian clown, right?
Yeah.
Like the ones in the circus that get out of the tiny car with 30 other dudes dressed just like them, and they know they're going to get hit in the face, right? They know they're going to get the pie in the face, and yet they show up and they do their job. You're going to get a pie in the face for this, brother. You know that.
Yeah.
You have pissed off powerful people from sea to shining sea. So first of all, congratulations for that. Congratulations for laughing while you did it. And then to the question, why? What in the world do you hope to accomplish?
Well, I had two things. First of all, I don't entirely know the reason why. I know what I was inspired to do and what I was thinking at the time. As I look at it now, there are aspects of this book and the whole inquiry that, if you take the helicopter up high enough, is not about Agent Orange and the tricks the government played, or Gulf War syndrome, or baby powder that causes cancer, or vaccines that cause brain damage. It's really about the way power operates, and it just doesn't feel. And when there's nobody to answer to, power does not feel that it needs to tell the truth. And then if it doesn't like the truth, and the truth is finding its way out, then there are these methods of debunking and pre-bunking and engaging supposed science when it's really just syntax. So that seems to be what I wrote about, though I didn't start off that way. I thought I was going to be writing about the Institute of Medicine, which is I should back up and just remind everybody that the Institute of Medicine is this tremendously revered government organization that studies things that are important to public health for the government and settles issues once and for all. Only It isn't a government agency. It's a private organization. The guy who runs it makes $1.1 million a year. All the experts are paid and paid well, and it's hardly unbiased. It actually is the government's crisis control PR division that
Let me back
uses.
up even
Yeah,
further and say that the book, for the record, is written from the point of view of a criminologist, which happens to
yeah,
be what you are. But at base, it's a story. And that's the compliment I meant to pay you initially. All of these facts, all of these forbidden facts, are woven together in a narrative. And anybody who appreciates a decent narrative knows the importance of a protagonist and an antagonist. You need a villain. So, as we start to talk about what you wrote and why you wrote it, tell me if I'm wrong, but it felt to me that if there's a Snidely Whiplash in this thing, twirling his metaphorical mustache and cackling maniacally in a corner, it's the IOM.
you're right on all counts, and I'd say the government that funds it and the corporations that fund it. But you're very right that it's a story, and it's a story of I ask in the first chapter, what's Agent Orange got to do with it? Agent Orange was a chemical warfare material that was used in Vietnam and sprayed on jungles and on people, and
Dioxin, right?
yeah, and it contained this tremendously toxic material that you just mentioned, and that caused a lot of injury and death to people, and then birth defects to the children, the offspring of Vietnam veterans when they got back. So they came to the Veterans Administration and the government and said, "Hey, we've got all these injuries from Agent Orange," and the government said, "Agent Orange? No, 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 that's not a biological weapon. That's just for plants. That won't hurt anybody." And people said, "Well, I'm hurt, and look at my children with severe deformities, exactly like animals have the result of severe deformities from dioxin." And the government eventually said, "Well, let's get to the bottom of this, and let's hire the Institute of Medicine, and the Institute of Medicine will answer this question once and for all." And so the Institute of Medicine convened a group of experts who concluded that there was no connection between dioxin, this known toxin, and all these injuries. And they concluded it by doing a study that 2 years later they published their report. And the conclusion was more studies needed. So 2 years later, they published their subsequent report, which had a much better conclusion. That was more studies needed. And then 2 years later, they did it again. And this one, interestingly, also concluded that more
Don't
studies
tell me.
needed.
Don't tell me.
Ah, damn it,
Chuck.
I spoiled it. Yeah, I
No, no,
waited
no.
some time.
I want to get Chuck involved. What do
Yeah,
you think
okay.
it concluded, Chuck?
So now we get up to
Uh,
year
th-
to year 19,
no
and
studies.
they now get really bold, and they say not only that more studies are needed, but they say we ought to study the actual veterans who were affected by the Agent Orange because they hadn't thought of that yet. So I don't have anything to criticize about that except that it literally took 20 effing years to get there, and then conclude that there was no connection between Agent Orange and all these terrible injuries that people had not been compensated for. Enter in the story Admiral Zumwalt, who does another inquiry for a congressional committee, and he comes back and he says that the IOM put forth the most fraudulent and terrible study he could imagine that was done entirely to save the U.S. government from any responsibility, and he found that they were dead wrong. And it's particularly poignant that he's the person who did that study and provided that testimony to Congress because he had ordered the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam, and his own son had died from it.
Ugh.
Yeah, so as stories go, that's a compelling part. Then the Veterans Administration did a study, and they too disagreed with Agent Orange. And then to jump ahead in the story, the two people who were most discredited for the shammy and scammy work that the Institute of Medicine did, were they fired? Were they demoted? No, no. They were promoted and then took over responsibility for studying childhood vaccines.
Soon may the noblemen come to bring a bottle for everyone. One day when the waiting is done, we'll take a drink and go.
Same two people. And so, I look in the book at the Institute of Medicine's Agent Orange debacle, and then their Gulf War syndrome, which, as far as they were concerned, what's Gulf War syndrome? We don't even think it exists. And then burn pits. How could that possibly hurt anybody? Probably healthy to breathe the smoke from burn pits. And then a bunch of other things where they always surprisingly concluded that the big bad corporation and the big bad government had nothing to do with it. And so that's the through line of the story. It involves the Institute of Medicine, but also how powerful centers in our society, the government and corporations, pay the Institute of Medicine for these conclusions.
Where is the Institute of Medicine today?
Well, naturally, it's located in a big, impressive building, part of the National Academies of Science in Washington, D.C. However, the National Academies of Science is also not a government agency and is also just a private organization that is also just paid money by large corporations, and today is actually seeking to expand its funding from large corporations. And it's had some doozies, baby powder doesn't cause cancer. That took 50 years
Johnson
to,
and Johnson, right?
yeah, Johnson and Johnson baby powder. It's the reason I say it took 50 years is that about 50 years ago, Johnson and Johnson went to the FDA and they asked for a special meeting. They sent a delegation and they said, "Look, we've got a little problem with our baby powder, and it's a little problem. It just contains a tiny bit of cancer-causing material, and the same material that's taken out of buildings. What is that called?
Asbestos.
Oh yeah, that's that terrible stuff. It's
Asbestos.
just in the baby powder." And the FDA said, "Well, thank you for telling us. We must immediately study how much asbestos is okay in baby powder." Uh, they never considered that the answer might be zero asbestos is okay in baby powder, but they began a study, and boy, when they study, I got to tell you, Mike, they really stick with it because they stuck with it for more than 40 years before they finally came out and said, "Yeah, there may be something to this." And then eventually they said, "Yeah, maybe the baby powder that Johnson and Johnson is making, maybe you shouldn't use that." And that was in 2024, last year.
Good God.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, back to my earlier point. How can your brain be asked to process that without those weird equal mixings of rage and absurdity? I mean, we all know, it seems, and I want to be certain of those kinds of superlatives because the debunking and the rebunking is really important too. But this idea that we know asbestos is bad, we know it, and yet we have to sit quietly back and watch this sort of unholy kabuki unfold as the experts come to the conclusion that Marge from Idaho realized decades ago was self-evident.
Yeah.
It's enough to make you nuts, Gavin.
Well, I think it's really true. And for a time in this book and the last book, I probably was nuts. And I still am not fully comfortable with accepting or taking on board that people can actually sit around a room and say, "Hey, we've got this new product, let's say the mRNA vaccine, and when you inject it in the arm, it's supposed to stay in the arm, but we know that it goes into the ovaries and the testes and the heart and the brain and crosses the blood-brain barrier, and we're just not going to tell anybody about that, and we're going to put this out publicly, even though we know it will cause cardiac problems for young people." It's very hard for me to cross that line and picture the people sitting in that room who can have that conversation. This book made it a little bit easier for me because somebody leaked the transcripts of the actual behind closed doors conversation that the Institute of Medicine was having when they studied whether any vaccine could cause any brain damage to any child in America, and concluded, of course not. Well, we got to get those transcripts. And when you read those transcripts, it's easier to believe that people actually do knowingly participate in something that awful and that damaging to that number of people. But it's true. Still hard, however, for me to accept.
But I mean, not to oversimplify it, but didn't the IOM simply write the headline before they jumped into the story regarding Agent Orange, regarding baby powder? Obviously we're going to get to vaccines and the mercury therein, but it just seems like in every case we're starting from a conclusion instead of from some kind of objective inquiry.
Well, you can always find any kind of study you want. And what I've learned is you can also fund any study you want with any result. And I won't jump ahead to vaccines beyond just saying, because I happen to have the page marked here, this is the first thing said in the behind closed doors meeting. The point of no return, the line we will not cross, is in public policy is to pull the vaccines or change the schedule. We wouldn't say compensate the injured, we wouldn't say pull the vaccines, and we wouldn't say stop the program. CDC wants us to declare that these things are pretty safe on a population level, and we are not ever going to come down that autism is a true side effect. That
Good
was day
God.
one, hour one, and then
Who's
two
who?
years more, 2 years more, so-called study to conclude what they ultimately concluded. So that's what goes on.
Do you, I mean, you name names in the book, you show pictures.
Yeah.
Who said that? Who was
That
listening?
particular thing was first said by Kathleen Stratton. She worked on Agent Orange as well, so we know that she's got a lot of experience with injury to children. And then the second part, we are not ever going to come down that autism is a true side effect, was said by Marie McCormick, rather. And she also, I think, worked on Agent Orange, but she ultimately ended up at the CDC working, as all parents would hope, on childhood vaccines.
Who in the world leaked it?
We don't know. We don't know. Some really good-hearted person. It's happened a couple of times. There's another secret meeting, even more secret, where they just warned everybody 10 times not to discuss this anywhere. And in that one, it was also leaked, and very favorably. I think, I want to give you a really weird analogy. Because when I was having trouble accepting that Pfizer really would do the things it's done so many times and been criminally fined for so many times, I was talking to a friend of mine, the novelist Bruce Wagner, and I said, it's just, you cannot get your mind around the idea that people sit in a room and talk like this and know what they're doing. And he said, well, it's a little bit like the conference at Wannsee. And I said, I don't know what the conference at Wannsee is. He said, go to Wikipedia and look it up. So I go look up the conference at Wannsee. And this is the conference at which Hitler's generals and various operatives go and meet with the civilian heads of government agencies, the Minister of Transportation, the Minister of Agriculture, et cetera. And these civilians, at this point, know very little about what we would call the final solution, what the plans were. And so the generals inform these civilians at this conference at Wannsee, and they say things like, well, then we're going to move 600,000 people by train to these relocation camps. And the Minister of Transportation chimes up and he says, no, we don't have enough seats. And the general says, well, we're not going to use seats. And it's slowly dawning on these civilians that this final solution is a much darker thing than they realized. And yet here they are being told by the powers that be in Germany that this is going to move forward, relocation camps. And when the meeting ends, they then break out the wine and they stop the euphemisms and they start talking about it all much more openly. And the reason I said it's an unusual analogy, Mike, is that too was transcribed and leaked. And you can find it on YouTube. People have performance films where they just say the actual words that were spoken. These aren't dramatic representations. They're documentaries that just have the exact conversation the way it evolved. And so can people do this? Yes, 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 and people do it. And I've got
So you
another.
have an anonymous whistleblower. Is there any pushback from the individuals that you just mentioned by name who are quoted in the transcripts? Is there any denial of it?
I haven't heard a denial, and I haven't gotten the letter from lawyers that will no doubt follow our discussion today. So
Great.
I don't know much about their position or what their position will be as things move forward.
Of all the conversations with which to blow myself up, it's the one with you while you're in Maui and I'm sitting here sweating it out in Northern California. This is where it all ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. This conference, when do you figure that was?
The conference at Wannsee is 1941 or 1942. Hitler's been in power for many years, and on the subject of pre-bunking and the
Yeah.
use of scientists, Hitler did another very interesting thing, where the administration did, and that is using scientists. It's very well described in a long and boring book called Hitler's Professors. But
Yep.
what they did is they started funding academics to do studies that concluded that Jews spread disease and that Jews adversely affect the economy and that Jews. And so the population was being moved slowly to a place where it could be what it became by the time of Kristallnacht and what it became by 1942. But
Right.
that happened in the very same way that the U.S. government, and yeah, no, I'm not making a comparison between Nazis and the Institute of Medicine. No. I'm making a comparison between the processes used by people in power, and they are identical.
I would go even further and make a comparison between the good Germans in 1939 and the sensible Americans in 2020. Now, all of a sudden, and look, God, please don't blow yourself up, Mike. Please don't blow yourself up. But if on the eve of the Kristallnacht, many good Germans look around and say to themselves, you know something? This doesn't feel right. This does not feel like a thing I'm comfortable accepting. But they'd been tenderized.
Yes.
They'd been tenderized for nearly a decade by Hitler's professors. And so a great many things that might have felt heretical or just straight up crazy had been introduced. And so, like the frogs in the boiling water, they had become desensitized to the place where, what do you mean we're not going to have seats on the trains? What do you mean we're going to move them? Like that didn't happen because we flipped a switch. Now, in the same way, how do you think about how we've been prepared or tenderized as citizens to accept a certain list of morals and dogma that cannot be questioned because they have been, quote, previously debunked? And before you answer, I'll just say that back when I, used to impersonate an actual interviewer and wanted to have some sides on this conversation, I Googled Gavin de Becker. I asked Chat GTP, whatever the hell it is, to comment on your book, and they do. And it's fascinating because virtually every paragraph starts with the fact that you're dealing with claims that have long since been debunked. Everything is qualified.
Yes.
Everything. And so I think maybe now, as we think about Agent Orange and we think about the baby powder and we think about all of the other ways these ideas come to fester and root, what is the role of the debunker in all of this and the attendant challenges?
Well, you're right on the mark of what I was exploring here from a criminal point of view, and that is the preparation of societies, in this case, including consumers who will pay for something, pharma products or whatever the products are. The preparation is long and effective and time tested. And in our case, we all experienced, say, in 2020, we experienced a form of mass madness that was accepted by most people, really because it was connected to science and because you were told or made to feel you'd be stupid if you didn't support the science, when it really meant the paid scientists, often, very often, by the way, paid by pharma. There's a Merck product that came out, and it had 18 studies, safety studies, published before the product came out. 16 of them were written by Merck employees, for example. There's so many examples like that. But we were told, 2020, wear a mask made out of anything. It can be made out of an old pair of socks. Just go to a fabric store and put something over your face, and that will somehow stop virons, which are, microscopic. Then we were told even wear two masks. And all our government officials, for a time, would wear a largish white mask with a black mask over it. So you'd see that they had two masks. And they'd put them on right outside of camera view before walking on for a press conference, and then take it off in order to talk, spreading COVID that would kill everybody in the process. We actually accepted the idea that we should clean the outside of the pizza box when the pizza's delivered, but it's fine to eat the pizza. We accepted the idea that contact transmission was possible, meaning you could touch something in the supermarket and suddenly you'd have COVID. We accepted the idea of standing 6 feet apart. We accepted the idea of a single vaccine that would give you immunity forever, morphing into a vaccine that you'd have to take again in 3 months, and again in 3 months, and again in 3 months, and then give to your 6-month-old baby every year for the rest of its life. We accepted all that bullshit. And we did it because we were tenderized, to use your word. And nobody does the tenderizing better than academics and what I have to call so-called scientists. They may have degrees, but they leave their degrees at the door when they decide to just do what the government wants them to do.
The Gift of Fear was the book that put you on the map, which has been 25 years now. I know it
Thanks.
still sells like crazy. How was it a gift in the context of what you just described? And was it fear in its undistilled form, or was it some level of something else? Because it's not just, I mean, we were scared, so we did a lot of those things, but right next to the fear that drove us to comply was the comfort that came from complying, and then this, I don't know, lordliness that came from correcting the heathens around us
Yes.
who hadn't yet fallen into line and needed to be educated. I use the example all the time. Chuck came up to visit me in Northern California at the height of the lockdowns, and we were walking around this neighborhood, which is a pretty quiet, isolated place. And on the far side of the street, a man was walking with 2 masks, and he lowered both to scream at us. Shouldn't you have your masks on?
Yes.
I couldn't decide if he was mostly scared or mostly delighting in an opportunity to correct. So, talk about all that vis-a-vis the gift of fear.
Well, fear is certainly used by every government in world history. All leaders in world history have used fear to control and influence populations. Fear of the outside tribe that's going to come and invade our village, and fear of the enemies that will come over the wall, and fear of disease, and fear of terrorism and communism, and ideas that got smaller and smaller and smaller. You start with fear of a real country and the soldiers in it, and then you go to an idea like communism, and then you go to terrorists, real people, then you go to terrorism, an idea, and then ultimately we came down to the smallest particle possible, which was the viron, viruses, been used for a long time. But that fear, just to give you the distinction, that fear is unwarranted fear, because in Gift of Fear, I describe what I'm talking about that's a gift is true fear. And true fear is always apparent because it occurs in the presence of danger, and it is something that you sense. You hear it, or you smell it, or you see it, or you touch it, or it touches you. That is true fear. Unwarranted fear are all the things that arise in the imagination. Anxiety, worry, the story we heard from 3 weeks ago or 3 months ago, the story we heard from somebody else that's operating in our brain. Now, there's a somewhat humorous example I give that if how can you tell the difference between true fear and unwarranted fear? Well, you're at the airport and you get that feeling, I shouldn't get on this plane. I shouldn't get on this plane, which many people have had that feeling. I should take another flight. And if that feeling is based on your memory of a news report from 3 months before where a terrible plane crashed somewhere, that's unwarranted fear because it's not in your presence. But if it's based on seeing the pilot stumble out of the bar at the airport drunk and board the plane, that is true fear because it's based on something you perceive in your presence. And that's the issue of like how you tell the difference, is that any time that a government or a marketer of a product tells us to be afraid of something, we have I think, patriotic duty to be skeptical and come to understand exactly what it is we're being asked to fear. What is it that's being used to herd us like cattle into a particular ramp and to get onto a particular truck? If it's something that's genuinely frightening, like lava coming down the street, when people see lava, they don't think about it. They don't make imaginings of what they should do. They just run away. They run down the street. And so it's our responsibility to figure out the difference between things people want us to fear and things that we actually have good reason to fear, and to figure that out and to live our lives accordingly.
I'm so sympathetic to parents with kids who are trying to either trust their gut or pick which expert to trust.
Yes.
They're going to read a book like this, and their faith in institutions is going to be shaken, maybe irrevocably. Spoiler alert, you do what you always do, which is why one of the things I like about you. There's several things I like about you, Gavin, but
Thank you, Mike.
in the end, your arguments are always rooted in a measure of personal responsibility. So, again, spoiler alert, but the book ends with trust yourself. Like in the wake of all these forbidden facts, there's not much you can really offer in the way of counsel other than to kick the tires until your toes break and then trust yourself.
Yeah.
Because in the end, right? In the end, that's what we're left with. Isn't the opposite also true when you say, when the government sets out to scare you, it's incumbent on us to say, why are you doing that? But in this world, it felt like we were being told not to be afraid. It's safe and effective, Gavin. It's safe and effective. That's not somebody trying to scare me. That's someone trying to assuage me in order to act in a certain way. And we have to discern, it seems, both of those things, sometimes contemporaneously. And what a pain in the ass that is for the average Joe.
Yeah, listen, it's not easy being human, and as I've raised 10 kids, and I have two teenagers now, two sons, 16 and 14, and the reality is, 17 and 15, a mistake I make too often, they will remind me. But the reality is that there's a lot of responsibility that goes with that, and of course, parents want to drive their kid to school and throw the kid out of the car and generally land near the building and know that it's now their responsibility. It's the school's responsibility, because the school, after all, is the government, and the government knows best, and the government has my best interest at heart, et cetera. We want to do that because we can't really get into, do I want to do a background check on every employee to know that there's no sexual predators working in the school? Were there ever? Might there be in the future? Are the policies sound? Does the fire safety system work? It's all too much. And so what I've done as a parent is, and we all do, we limit. We're going to trust certain things like traffic lights and road works and aircraft and airlines and elevators and escalators. We're going to trust certain things that we know are beyond our ability to fully dig into. But I draw the line at that which you want to actually inject, or you want my child to ingest or eat or think or do. That becomes too much. We all have to make these decisions ultimately. And I say in this book that no parent in America would let a stranger walk up to their baby and inject it with something that the parent doesn't understand or know what it is. And yet, nearly every parent in America does exactly that when they go to the Long's Drugs or the Rite Aid or the local pharmacy, and they have a 23-year-old pharmacist assistant who was hired 3 weeks ago, if you even know that, inject something you don't understand and you don't know what it is. And so in this book, I tell what it is. I have a lot of pro-vaccine information and a lot of QR codes that lead to links that are pro-vaccine. But when you really know what the ingredients are, and when you really understand what they're meant to do, and when you understand the history of it, and you understand that the same government that told you that Agent Orange was no problem, and burn pits were no problem, and Gulf War syndrome was no problem, and baby powder was no problem, that's the one telling you, to use your term, Mike, safe and effective. Now, is safe and effective itself a use of fear? It is. Because those are both fear words, right? Safe conjures danger, and they're telling you this product is safe, but you're in danger. That's the key message. And then effective is telling you that you need this, and its effectiveness is important because otherwise you're dead from the virus. And you and everybody you know, your grandmother and everybody else, they're all perished and doomed if you don't take this product that we're telling you is safe, unlike the dangerous virus, and effective. It's still the fear button after all.
But there's also this other patina on it. Like, you can shake your finger at me and tell me, oh, there's too much sugar in all that soda pop, or there's too much alcohol and all that liquor. You can go down the list and find all of the injurious things I'm doing to myself. Smoking is a great example, but the whole argument tipped when we introduced secondhand smoke. And
Yeah.
now we're outside the bounds of my own domain. Now I'm impacting people around me. And man, I mean, wasn't that the thing that just tipped us straight into crazy town with all of this? It wasn't just the lecture, it wasn't just the experts saying, do it for your own good or do it for the sake of your kids. Now it was, you're going to kill your neighbor. You're going to kill you are just a menace right now
You know,
because you're uninformed.
Actually, Mike, it came at you exactly as you describe it, but it came at you in many, many ways. And the persuasion campaign was probably the largest and best funded persuasion campaign in the history of the world. I'm talking about COVID vaccines, mRNA vaccines all over the planet, billions of doses. And it came at you in the form that you just said, which is you'll be helping others and you'll be meeting your civic duty and you'll be saving grandma and you'll be protecting other people. This is a method that's been used before, was used for the swine flu in 1976, that was eventually taken off the market because it caused paralysis and Guillain-Barré syndrome. But the same method, even in 1976, they were saying that, if you hug this person and then the mailman goes home and his mother is sick and she gets it and then she gets it and then she gets on a plane and gives it to her friend and she gets it. And it explained the same premise. But in addition to that, there was the premise that you can't get on an airplane. You can't go to a restaurant. You can't keep your job. And so there were some personal consequences given for making a choice to not get the mRNA vaccine, for example, which now, today, already, it's only a few years, is, in countries all over the world, Western countries all over the world, not even allowed for people under 50 years old, and certainly not allowed for children. But in the United States, until Bobby Kennedy, it was still on the list for every 6-month-old baby. Three injections for every 6-month-old baby, for God's sake.
I was in a small airport last week, standing on a little jetway that hadn't been maintained in a while. And on the wall, it still urged me really, to stay 6 feet away from whoever was in front or behind me.
Yeah.
And out of nowhere, Gavin, a wave of nausea washed over me.
Yeah.
And I know so many people now, frankly, myself included, that if I could go back in time, I wouldn't have taken it.
Yeah.
I have a good reason, or I have a reason. I don't know if it's a good one, and I suppose everybody does too. Mine wasn't rooted in fear, I don't think, unless maybe the fear of not being able to work or
Yeah.
the fear of a loss
That's a good
of,
one.
right? I mean, so I just wonder, are we going to look back at this, or are our kids going to look back at this? And where will those 5 years reside in the hierarchy of consequential moments in the history of modern civilization? I mean, compare it to the First World War, the Second World War, compare it to whatever you want. Will there be anything more consequential than what we just went through?
I think there really won't be, in so many forms, the interruption of infrastructure that caused millions of starvations, the enormous shift of wealth, hundreds of thousands of businesses just in America put out of business forever, and then the long-term physical consequences that we are learning more about all the time. There are studies that come out all the time, hundreds of studies, by the way, that you can find in that book. I've got 400 and some odd citations, but hundreds of specific examples of young people, particularly young boys, having sudden cardiac death that is arguably the result of the mRNA vaccine. And when I say arguably, there's plenty of studies, including that the CDC has now, put that on the vaccine product information sheet, that it causes myocarditis and pericarditis. So we won't know the long-term medical consequences of injecting the entire planet, or just about, with a product that wasn't ready for prime time. Now, you said, how will we look back at it? That's a tougher question, because the victor tends to write history. And so, those people who storm into Rome and destroy all of the particular kinds of statues or particular icons or particular buildings, they get to write the history. And this is true for world wars. If you go to the museum in Hiroshima that discusses and commemorates is the wrong word, but reveals the facts behind the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's a totally different story than I was taught in school. And my wife is Japanese, and I remember when I first met her, she was showing me something, and it was an architectural, it was a building, a monument. And I said, "Oh, what's that?" And she said, "Cut it out." I said, "No, what do you mean? What is that? I don't know what it is." She said, "Cut it out. That's the Hiroshima Arch." And I said, "Listen, darling, in my school, it was 5 minutes of study. There's no arch that Americans are taught about. There's no monument of any kind." She said, "Really?" And she was really surprised. It would be like if you didn't know the Statue of Liberty. And so when I went to the Hiroshima Museum with my sons and my wife, and we all had a good cry, the story told is a different story than the story told by the victors in the United States and in the Western countries. So, what will be the story of these 5 years we've experienced, in which people were literally locked in their homes and not allowed to engage? Families of divorced families, for example, the kids couldn't go from the mother's house to the father's house because that would be mixing households. In Hawaii, where I live, the governor put out an order that I had to send to friends in the mainland because they wouldn't believe me if I just told them. It said all forms of transportation are prohibited other than for essential businesses. It said musical instruments. You could only play guitar. You couldn't play instruments that blew air. Brother, it was insane. You could walk on a beach, but you could not stop on the beach because walking is exercise and stopping is death. A man fined $5,000 for not wearing a mask on a surfboard. True story. It was literally madness. And how will it be remembered? Well, I think the most damaging is a hard word. The one that has touched me most deeply in my heart is to know that something around 3.5 million Americans died in hospitals, not from COVID, but from all things, as happens every year, alone, because they couldn't have a family member to hold their hands because it would be, so dangerous to let anybody into the hospital. That's a dark reality. That's a dark one. And another dark one is that people were not allowed to gather together. Why does that matter? Well, we're social animals, and it's what gives us social cohesion. We're all at the concert of some performing artist, and we don't look over and say, "Oh, that guy over there voted for Trump," or "That one over there voted for Biden. Oh, I hate that guy. Oh, that guy doesn't care about other people. Oh, that guy's right or left." We just enjoy the music together. We don't go to the beach and say, "Oh, that dad over there is an awful guy. He voted for Trump or Biden," or whatever our hate methods were. But when we were all at home and we weren't allowed to gather like that, what were we left with? Social media that does inspire anger and hostility and hate. And that broke the world, in my opinion. That period of COVID lockdowns in all the countries where it worked broke the world. It's still not back. Hotels are not back to providing service. Hospitals are not back to providing service. People don't want to go back to work. I'm almost done with this long answer, Mike, but when the new administration that's in Washington right now went in, I had reason to speak to several officials. And I learned that almost nobody had gone to work in 5 years. Almost nobody in D.C. The buildings were empty $1 billion was spent on air conditioning and heating buildings that were empty. Only janitors and security guards were working in those buildings. Can we believe that that happened and all the way up till Trump was continuing to happen? Holy shit. So these 5 years are incalculably destructive. How will they be remembered? Probably, it's possible that lots of people will say the COVID vaccine saved the planet from the terrible scourge of COVID.
Look, we're still not quite flat on how to think about Stonewall Jackson unless you go to Georgia.
Yeah,
That
that's
that
true.
that I truly understand, but I think I'd like to ask you about words, language. Everything you just described was a kind of assault on liberty, rooted in fear, but with it came an assault on the language wherein the words stopped meaning what I thought they meant. And throughout this book, we see how pandemic doesn't mean what it used to mean.
Yeah.
Vaccines don't mean what it used to mean. There's just a long list of words that got slowly redefined to the point where I don't know that their definitions are currently recognizable. And as you riff on that and collect your thoughts, I was also struck by a couple pages in your book where the authoritative organs project the deaths likely to occur from a swine flu, from the avian flu, from the COVID. I mean, there's a long list of things. Even some of the
Mad cow disease,
yeah,
bird flu. Yes, yes.
right. So what that page made me think of, and obviously the projections next to the realities is the thing I want you to comment on. But my point too was that same weird lack of true understanding exists with Chernobyl and Fukushima and 3 Mile Island. And, I still remember looking at the map of Europe in the wake of Chernobyl, and half of it, well, maybe a third, was just blackened out. And experts with many initials after their names were saying this could be it. This thing could literally, a third of Europe could be uninhabitable,
Yes.
right? What, like 17 people died. So, if you would, what have we done to our language, and how can we live with these authoritative agencies who have so completely beclowned themselves with regard to projections that were not only off, but cosmically off?
Yeah, so I'll hit both of those, and thank you for raising them. The language thing is very interesting because often when you can't change, for example, a law or a regulation, let's say there was a regulation about pandemics, and you can't change the regulation, what you can do all by yourself without going to Congress and without getting elected to any office is you can change the definition of the word. And I'll give you two fast examples. Here is the CDC's original definition of the word vaccine: a product that stimulates a person's immune system to produce immunity to a specific disease, protecting the person from that disease. Now, that's what we grew up with. You take this injection and you won't get polio. You will be immune to polio and you will be protected from this disease. That was for all of our lives and instill in most people's consciousness what it means when you say vaccine. But here
To
is
be
the
immunized.
say what? You're immunized, of course.
To be immunized, yes.
Here is the actual CDC's new improved definition of vaccine: a preparation that is used to stimulate the body's immune system against diseases. So what have they dropped? They've dropped producing immunity to the disease. They've dropped protecting the person from getting the disease. Those two ideas died of COVID in 2020. And then the other one that's worth mentioning quickly is pandemic. As defined by the World Health Organization, this is what pandemic used to mean. An influenza pandemic occurs when a new influenza virus appears against which the human population has no immunity, resulting in, and this is the key part, several simultaneous epidemics worldwide with enormous numbers of deaths and illness. In other words, an emergency. Here's the new and improved definition of pandemic from the World Health Organization. It's really short. An influenza pandemic may occur when a new influenza virus appears against which the human population has no immunity. So what was dropped? You don't need a single death anymore to call it a pandemic. It doesn't need to be widespread to call it a pandemic. It doesn't need to be simultaneous in more than one country. It doesn't need to be worldwide. And so they get all the power and all the funding and all the fun of declaring a new pandemic on the basis only of the fact that it's a virus that's new. That's it.
But 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 new was not sexy enough. We had to go with novel.
Yeah.
It's the
a word,
novel
a word that would
coronavirus.
mean less to people. That's right. The second part of your question had to do with the projections, and projections are typically modeling, meaning they are, ideas and mathematical suggestions of how terrible a thing could be. Many of the projections that we've all lived by have come from something called the Imperial College in London, and here's their history. In 2002, they predicted 150,000 deaths in the UK from mad cow disease. The actual number, not 150,000, 170.
Oops.
In 2005, they predicted 200 million people could die from bird flu. The actual number, over 6 years, 282.
Whoops.
Yep, whoops is right. In 2009, they predicted 65,000 flu deaths in the UK. The actual number, 45. That was swine flu, by the way. In 2020, they predicted 179,000 COVID deaths in Taiwan in the first full year of the pandemic. The actual number of deaths in Taiwan in the first year of the pandemic, 10. So the modelers basically have run our world in recent years by giving government what they want, which is there could be hundreds of millions of deaths from this, and that links to the vaccine saved 150 million people. In the book, I discuss how these projections, these modeling projections, are just radically off base, and they become facts. Like it's a fact now that vaccines have saved 154 million lives, until you learn that it includes things like the tetanus vaccine, where in all of the United States, in 10 years, the number of tetanus deaths was 13, and they were all old people. So how then would you say that billions of life years of people's lives were saved by the tetanus vaccine? Because the tetanus vaccine, there's 1.5 billion people on Earth who haven't had it. And guess what they have? The exact same death rate as the ones who have had it. Same with measles. The death rate for measles going back many, many years, 22 years, in the United States was 0. And it was 0 for the vaccinated, and it was 0 for the 9 million unvaccinated. So when you make these ridiculous reaches to say things like, 1.1 billion life years resulted because of the tetanus vaccine, I want to just quickly, by the way, for people who are interested, say something favorable about the tetanus vaccine, which is that you can give it at the time of the injury. You don't have to give it prophylactically. So, and the injury, by the way, comes from a very deep wound,
puncture.
with wood or metal, a deep puncture, but it also has to have the tetanus bacterium on it. Tetanus is not transmissible. Tetanus is incredibly hard to find on Earth. There's a chart in the book most people wouldn't believe, but it shows that in all of Europe, 24 countries, whatever it is, all but 2 countries had 0 tetanus. In all of Russia in 2022, 1 case of tetanus. In all of Central America, 20 some odd countries, fewer than 10 cases per 100,000. Not deaths, just cases. Because when you get that injury, you can at that moment in the hospital, they always say to you, no matter what, even if you had a tetanus shot a year ago, 5 years ago, they say, we'll give you a booster. So they're going to do it anyway because of the deep puncture wound, on the off chance that you are one of the, listen to this is true math, one of the 150 million people in America, it's 1 out of 150 million, will die of tetanus.
So 2 a year.
In some years, and often 0 a year. Here's, if you want to go really crazy, you look at polio, which is the greatest killer of all time, we are told. That's the spin. But I'm going to tell you how many polio deaths there were in the world, on Earth, last year, out of 8 billion people, the number of polio deaths last year was zero. Zero. Polio. 99% of the people who contract the polio virus have no symptoms. They never know they even had it. Of the 1% who do know that they had it, they have what amounts to a cold that resolves typically within a week. And of that percentage, about 1% of them suffer the big dreaded consequence, which is paralysis. On Earth last year, there were 154 human beings out of 8 billion, 541 human beings out of 8 billion who had polio myelitis paralysis, and 97% of them were vaccine-induced poliomyelitis, meaning it was the vaccine
Whoa.
strain, not the wild. That's the truth. That's the truth, all documented from the CDC, by the way, in this book. And yet, polio is the one that they use like crazy to say, well, you don't want to get polio, do you? For all I know, I've had polio, maybe several times. We don't know. But the bottom line is that this thing we were told is like instant death, the CDC tells you on their website that 99% of the cases, and by the way, I got one more for you. Half of the people who actually experience the dreaded outcome, which is paralysis, half of them recover. So this whole idea, I'm not saying it's a great thing to get polio or that, that it's not a problem on Earth, but it's not a problem on Earth. But putting that aside, they will quickly say, well, that's all because of the vaccine. How does that account for the more than 1 billion people who didn't take the vaccine and yet have the same death rate and the same paralysis rate and the same side effect rate? The problem with this whole thing is it doesn't work. It doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and that's why it's treated like a religion.
I think the thing that is most terrifying about all of it is that it's so much broader than just this one thing. It's the curse of the consensus.
Yeah.
And like back to all of the stuff that accompanied Chat GPT's analysis of your book, all the parentheticals,
Yeah.
long since debunked, proven as misinformation. It just reminds me of if you go looking at global warming arguments, you'll find that 98% of the scientists, that there's a consensus, right?
Yes.
And I'm not even sure what the consensus is, but this idea that the science is settled, that feels like it's a core part of your book as well, because you talk about gravity and you talk about a great many things that at any given time in the world we were awfully certain about. We
Yes.
talk about it's, Chuck and I were having this conversation the other day on a slightly adjacent matter, but it had to do with this nexus of faith versus skepticism, and how for the longest time there was a supernatural explanation for virtually every inexplicable thing.
Yes.
But once we determined that maybe the sun wasn't being dragged through the heavens by chariots, and once we determined that maybe taking most of the blood out of George Washington's body wasn't the way to keep him alive, blah, 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 less supernatural, more science. And now it just feels to me like the real rush is not to figure out the truth of a thing, it's to shut somebody up who is not on board with the settled
Yes,
part.
it's to lock down information as settled when the term settled science is against everything that science is, which is continued exploration. Of course, we know that all these things have changed in the last 100 years and 1,000 years as we've learned new things. The problem is that we now pretend like we've gotten to the end, and this is now settled science. Will you indulge me to read something from my book
Of course.
on this topic?
Sure.
Okay, because it's a good example of how the arc works in the early experimenters with vaccines, for example. Why is it called vaccines? Because vacca means cow. The early vaccines were pus taken from cows that had cowpox and then put onto wounds on human beings, eventually injected into human beings, pus from cows, pus from horses. and a whole lot of other things, but they were experimenting and they were advancing. And some of the old-timey vaccine ingredients, now I'm reading, were made by steeping them for years in a mix of ox bile, glycerin, and potato slices. And yes, really potato slices. But over time, vaccines evolved because science evolves, and over time, they began to include dried rabbit spinal cords, duck embryos, chicken blood, human bile, because God knows you don't want to throw that away. You want to use that for an injection, ground up rat spleens, and boiled pig skin. Now, all of that is about the past. We've come a long way since then. Here are some ingredients in today's modern vaccines: gelatin from boiled pig skin, chicken embryo protein, blood from the hearts of cow fetuses, human fetus DNA fragments, albumin from human blood plasma, oil extracted from the shark's liver, protein from armyworm ovaries, and finally, monkey kidney DNA fragments. Now, all of that is true. And it reminds me of that Shakespearean, the Macbeth scene where the witches are stirring the brew and they're saying, eye of newt, toe of frog, lizard's leg, tongue of dog. It's not really that different. And just quickly to read one more paragraph. In today's vaccines, formaldehyde, I don't have to say anything bad about formaldehyde, I guess people know it, polysorbate 80, which is linked to infertility, potassium chloride. Now, this is a great one. Potassium chloride is the final injection that's given to people when we execute them with lethal injection, but of course, much higher volume than we give to infants. Phenol, which is listed by the FDA as a hazardous substance, borax, you can imagine that's probably not good for you, MSG, monosodium glutamate, and finally the big one, ethyl mercury, which until just a few weeks ago, thanks to RFK Jr., was in all kinds of vaccine products given to children, even though the FDA and the CDC claimed it had been removed in 2005. It wasn't. It was still in 6 vaccines given until just very recently. Mercury, for God's sakes, injected into people.
I would encourage people, if you have a relationship with ChatGPT or Gronk or whoever your favored assistant is, ask it about mercury. And it's, I don't, with the possible exception of radioactive material, is there a substance on the planet that is more widely?
No.
I mean, don't touch it, don't eat it, don't sniff it. It will kill you. It's like crystal clear until you ask the AI if it's okay to inject it. And then it gets weirdly awkward. It's like cough, cough. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, how what are we doing?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The mercury has been so well established. There are a couple of world events, the Minamata disaster, it's called, Minamata, Japan, where the people in this small village started noticing that their cats were acting unusual by falling into the ocean and dying. And then they noticed that their friends were acting unusual by falling into the ocean and dying, or first going crazy and then dying. And so they wondered what was up. Nearby was the Chisso Corporation factory, and they also wondered what was up because for 10 years they'd been feeding the cats their mercury waste product that they were dumping into the ocean as a test because they were trying to figure out what was going on too. The difference is they were doing it in secret, not telling the people of Minamata. And so for 10 years they continued to dump mercury into the oceans, and the fishermen would get sick from the fish, and of course the cat who shared the same diet would get sick from the fish and die. That went on for 10 years until finally it was acknowledged, and the Chisso Corporation paid some of the survivors, the ones that hadn't died. By the way, the Chisso Corporation is still in business and doing great, just like Pfizer is still in business and doing great. So after that, there was the Iraq disaster with mercury, where a bunch of seeds were shipped to Iraq and they had been treated with mercury as a preservative and an insecticide. And on the bags, the sacks that contained the mercury, it said, lethal and poison, and it had the skull and crossbones. And all of that didn't mean anything to the Iraqis. Skull and crossbones is not a graphic icon that's used there. So they ate it. They cooked it into bread. And 100,000 people got sick from it, and it was one of these great disasters of mercury around the world. And then I have to add to that the little matter of hundreds of millions of children being injected with mercury all over the world, now billions. By the way, what RFK Jr. did by making it no longer a viable vaccine ingredient in childhood vaccines, all over the rest of the world, it's still used hundreds of millions of times. Mercury, I'm not a scientist, but I have enough brain cells left to know that mercury should not be injected into human beings.
So the obvious question I can hear people screaming is why? What? Why are all these Shakespearean? Why is it still a witch's brew? What is the purpose of all of these wild components, including and especially mercury? And in the same breath, what possible reason could you have for deliberately putting asbestos into baby powder? I get why dioxin went into Agent Orange, and I understand why there might be a giant concerted effort to maybe redirect or misdirect the inquiry around that. But what is the affirmative reason to put these clearly toxic substances into these things?
Well, in the case, let's take mercury first. So what? And by the way, aluminum is also on that list. It is also in many childhood vaccines, and is also a heavy metal that's not good for you. The stated reason is that mercury was added as a preservative. The actual reason, in my opinion, is that it was added as an adjuvant. An adjuvant is a vaccine ingredient that causes the body to say, whoa, what the hell, I don't like that, and mount an immune response. Why is that important? Because back in the days when CDC and FDA were actually doing their jobs, a vaccine would have to prove that it was effective by showing that it got an immune reaction a certain percentage of the time. Sometimes it was called 90%, later it was called 50%, but in any case, you had to show that something happened when you injected this thing into the body. That's an adjuvant. It's there to insult the body so that the body reacts and says, every time I see that thing from now on, I'm going to mount an immune response. And with it is a measles viron or a particle from some disease that is the target disease. So if you follow that, the adjuvant is meant to aggravate the body, and it was often said by toxicologists that the more toxic the vaccine, the more effective the vaccine. It sort of goes in the category of no, you inject me with something, my body is going to go, whoa, what the hell's that? And if it doesn't have that reaction, then you're not going to get much of an immune response. And so they say it's a preservative. I don't believe them. I believe it was always meant to be an adjuvant because you couldn't find a better one. And they claim and maybe believed that it was only trace amounts, so it didn't matter, even though ChatGPT or Grok or any other AI will tell you that mercury in any quantity, no matter how small, those are the words it'll use, no matter how small, should not be touched, should not be breathed, should not be eaten, and should not be injected other than in childhood vaccines. So that's sort of my opinion in the matter. But your why still stands strong, and it links up to how. In other words, how in the world can we, I just read the vaccine ingredients, and experimentation continues. And, is virology an acceptable science that really makes sense and is a discipline that we should all follow? I have to put that in the category of maybe. It might be a little bit of black magic, but it's a priesthood. And like any discipline, scientific discipline, it's a priesthood that will do anything possible to protect itself and to get attention and to get funding.
What are you saying to people who will listen to this or glance at your book and not necessarily read it? And by the way, I should mention that, like your previous book, Cause Unknown, I think it was, you've mentioned these QR codes. I want people to understand that very, very rarely is there a page in this book
Yeah, this is
that
what it looks
isn't
like.
filled with those things. That's what it looks like. So it's not just a footnote, right? I really recommend reading the book with your phone nearby, because if you read something that simply sounds inexplicable, you just scan it and you hit it, and you can take a fairly deep detour, but maybe not a detour, because in the end, man, you're going to have to defend yourself. You're going to be called an anti-vaxxer, and I would love to hear, how you're going to respond to that, how you have responded to it, and when the business of being skeptical turns you into not an inquisitive seeker of truth, but a denier.
If you like what you heard,
And even if you don't,
won't you please,
pretty please, subscribe. Well, I hate to beg and I hate to plead, but please, pretty freaking please, please subscribe.